So, New York Times released this article titled, "They Pause Puberty, but Is There a Cost?" And as you will find, this article lacks all sense of journalistic integrity, and there's a lot of really deceptive tactics that this article uses that are very common in anti-trans rhetorical techniques. Things like concern trolling, things like appealing to ignorance. There are very deceptive tactics that the anti-trans arguments use, and not even the New York Times is immune to this, unfortunately. As the number of adolescents who identify as transgender grows, drugs known as puberty blockers have become the first line of intervention for the youngest ones seeking medical treatment. Their use is typically framed as a safe and reversible way to buy time to weigh a medical transition and avoid the anguish of growing into a body that feels wrong. Transgender adolescents suffer from disproportionately high rates of depression and other mental health issues. Studies show that the drugs have eased some patients' gender dysphoria. See, this kind of phrasing of like, typically framed as safe, eased some patients' gender dysphoria. The overwhelming medical consensus is very clear. Not very many kids go on puberty blockers, and those that do, it tends to have a profound impact on their mental health and overall well-being. Peer-reviewed study in pediatrics found that access to puberty blockers was associated with a 73% reduction in suicidality. Here is the peer-reviewed article from Pediatrics, which essentially just assessed the mental health outcomes in trans people receiving puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and they found a 73% reduction in suicidality. Right there. 73% lower. That's awesome. There was also this peer-reviewed study we have from Pelos 1. This one was really interesting because they were able to follow up with people into adulthood. This one found that access to gender-affirming hormones in adolescence was associated with a 40 to 50% reduction in suicidality in adulthood, which, that's really cool. These effects last into adulthood. That's awesome. Yes, all of these are indeed linked in my master doc. So the scientific evidence is pretty clear. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, they really help trans youth, and they help them into adulthood. Meanwhile, this article is trying to phrase it as, well, it can help some people, which is just a little bit dishonest, especially given where the medical research is at. But an increasing number of adolescents identify as transgender in the United States, an estimated 300,000 ages 13 to 17, and an untold number who are younger. Concerns are growing among some medical professionals about the consequences of the drugs, a New York Times examination found. So here's the dishonest framing. Just because somebody identifies as transgender does not mean that they're going to receive medical treatment. And by saying that there are 300,000 trans youth, this makes it sound like 300,000 kids are going on puberty blockers. They're framing it as, this is the first line of treatment, this is happening at an increasing alarming rate, and it makes it seem like there's 300,000 kids going on puberty blockers. But here is the actual numbers from Reuters. The number is 4,780 over the past 5 years. That is extremely small compared to this 300,000 number that this article's throwing out. See how deceptive that is? Questions are fueling government reviews in Europe, prompting a push for more research and leading some prominent specialists to reconsider at what age to prescribe them and for how long. This is so dishonest. By saying some specialists, some prominent specialists, these are tiny minorities within the medical community. It's like for every 99 doctors that are like, yeah, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Endocrine Society, all these guidelines are backed by research and data, seems like a good thing. And then you have the one scientist that's like, well, I don't like trans people and I have concerns. They're kind of framing this as like equal weight to the doctors that are like, yes, transition helps people. That's the dishonest framing. It is absolutely the overwhelming body of scientific research which shows that puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones help trans kids. And it's this minority opinion that they are framing as prominent specialists. Very dishonest framing. And as far as like pushing for more research in the countries that are more trans accepting, they want to do more research on this stuff because it's always good to have more data, especially given that, you know, trans people make up such a small portion of the general population. We're getting more and more trans kids that are being out here. We have the opportunity to do better research, to collect more data. Pushing for more research is a wonderful thing, and enrolling people that get treatment into research programs is a wonderful thing. I know that's what there's like a new British policy that is going to essentially automatically enroll kids that go on puberty blockers into a research program. I think that's an awesome idea, that we should collect data on the people that get these treatments. More data is always a good thing, but framing this as like, oh, we're scared and that's why we have to do more research, that's the dishonest framing. Dutch doctors first offered puberty blockers to transgender adolescents 3 decades ago, typically following up with hormone treatment to help patients transition. Since then, the practice has spread to other countries with varying protocols, little documentation of outcomes, and no government approval of the drugs for that use, including by the US Food and Drug Administration. This is such a horrible, horrible framing. Obviously, there are different protocols across countries. This is true about like any medicine. Little documentation of outcomes is quite an interesting statement, given that we have so many peer-reviewed sources. No government approval for the drugs of that use. Essentially, they're talking about off-label drug use. This is used as kind of like a fear-mongering tactic to say, oh, it's scary. Why are doctors using this off-label drug use? But it's important to note that off-label drug use is exceptionally common in the medical field. 21% of all prescriptions are off-label drug use. That's a fifth of all drugs that are prescribed to people. More than a fifth is off-label drug use. Treating people's inability to sleep with diphenhydramine, that's off-label drug use. Lots of people use Benadryl, diphenhydramine as a sleep aid, but that's off-label drug use. You see how it's so silly to fearmonger about this stuff? This is the really funny one. Sildenafil, for those that don't know, that's Viagra. Viagra has an off-label drug use for pulmonary hypertension in children. This would be the perfect one to fearmonger about off-label drug use, actually, to make the argument that, oh my gosh, they're giving children Viagra to treat pulmonary hypertension? Yeah, because it works. Same thing is true about puberty blockers for trans kids. But there is emerging evidence of potential harm from using blockers, according to reviews of scientific papers and interviews with more than 50 doctors and academic experts around the world. Oh my goodness. Essentially what they're doing here is they're collecting all of the 1% of doctors and then just tallying them up. Like essentially, you can come up with a board of sham doctors. Just ask the state of Florida. That's exactly what they did when they voted to medically detransition all teenagers in Florida. Here's this article citing the sham doctors. They're trying to point this as a stronger source than the overwhelming body of peer-reviewed research. Remember, they described what the overwhelming body says as typically framed as safe, as easing some patients' gender dysphoria, and now they're over here going, more than 50 doctors and academic experts around the world. This is a horribly dishonest framing. Like, there is no academic integrity or journalistic integrity in this blatantly dishonest framing. During puberty, bone mass typically surges, determining a lifetime of bone health. When adolescents are using blockers, bone density growth flatlines on average, according to an analysis commissioned by the Times Observational Studies examining the effects. Many doctors treating trans patients believe that they will recover that loss when they go off blockers, but 2 studies from the analysis that track trans patients' bone strength while using blockers and through the first years of sex hormone treatment found that many do not fully rebound and lag behind their peers. Here's the issue. It is true that surges in bone density happens in puberty when you get your surge of estrogen or testosterone. Now, if you're a kid that goes on puberty blockers, you'll typically go on puberty blockers for about 2 years, which means that the kids that didn't go on puberty blockers have about a 2-year head start on you for increased bone density. So essentially, what we would want to do is we would want to compare kids who have gone through puberty for 2 years with kids who have been on puberty blockers for 2 years and then also gone off puberty blockers for 2 years. That would be the equivalent control. But they're not doing that. What they're doing is they're comparing the first year after puberty blockers with the puberty kids who have been on puberty for 3 years. So essentially, the kids that have gone through the puberty, the control group, has 3 years of hormones to develop their bone density. Meanwhile, the puberty blocker group only has 1 year to develop their bone density. There's a 2-year difference in the amount of time they've had to develop their bone density, and that's why they're not at the same level. They used a bad control here. And now, let's fearmonger about this bad control. That could lead to heightened risk of debilitating fractures earlier than would be expected from normal aging, in their 50s instead of 60s. How can they make claims about their 50s and 60s when we're talking about people who are 15 years old? This is so dishonest. And more immediate harm for patients who start treatment with already weak bones, experts say. So we still don't have any evidence from these studies that they're presenting that their bone density doesn't fully rebound because we don't have an appropriate control in the studies we're talking about. There's going to be a price, said Dr. Sandeep Khosla, who leads a bone research lab at the Mayo Clinic, and the price is probably going to be some deficit in skeletal mass. We're just taking like one dissenting doctor who's expressing concerns from an appeal to ignorance, by the way, another logical fallacy, and they're framing this as valid or more valid than the overwhelming body of peer-reviewed scientific data. This article is insane, and it's in the New York Times too. Many physicians in the United States and elsewhere are prescribing blockers to patients at their first stage of puberty, as early as 8. That would be more so like precocious puberty. and align the precursors to sex hormones as soon as 12 or 13. I have never seen any kind of like medical guideline where kids get on cross-sex hormones at like age 12. I've always seen like age 14 as like the minimum for cross-sex hormones, but that could force life-altering choices, other doctors warn, before patients know who they really are. But what's the life-altering choices of puberty blockers? Puberty blockers are reversible. That's the whole point. You can stop taking the puberty blockers and you'll resume puberty just as you normally would. So how is that a life-altering choice? You are not locked into any kind of path just by taking puberty blockers. It just pauses your puberty. In fact, it gives you more time to make the best choice you can. If you're, say, a teen who, might have gender dysphoria, and you have 2 more years to go through gender therapy, to talk to doctors and psychiatrists and figure out whether or not you want to medically transition, this is just buying time. That's all it's doing. In 2015, 4 prominent American gender clinics were awarded $7 million to examine the effects of blockers and hormone treatment on transgender youths. In explaining their study, the researchers pointed out that the United States had produced no data on the impact and safety of blockers, particularly among transgender patients younger than 12, leaving a gap in evidence for the practice. 7 years in, they have yet to report key outcomes of their work, but say the findings are coming soon. They both want outcomes that, would assess into adulthood, and they also want people to be assessed at younger than age 12. Well, guess what? If you want to assess groups that are younger than age 12 and also assess groups that are adults, you're going to need a minimum of what, like 6-7 years to do so? Just to do the study itself, and that's not even to compile the results, to get it published. Peer review is a bit of a lengthy process, especially in some journals. So, we're talking about probably like at least an 8-year process, which would make sense that the findings are coming soon. If you truly want to have it both ways, where we get data about people that are younger than 12, and we get data that is longitudinal into adulthood, you have to have a study that goes for at least 7 or 8 years. That's just how we have to conduct the research. Many young patients and their families have concluded that the benefits of easing the despair of gender dysphoria far outweigh the risks of taking blockers. Because that's what the overwhelming body of scientific consensus shows. That's what the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Endocrine Society, every major reputable medical association in the United States says this. That's why. That's what most parents are doing. For others, the limited studies and politicization of trans medicine can make it difficult to fully evaluate the decision. I don't think that limited studies is that valid of a concern, given that we have lots and lots of studies. But the politicization of trans medicine is indeed a problem. I wish that people would talk to doctors and psychiatrists more than they would listen to Matt Walsh on this subject. That would absolutely make things better for everyone. Multiple medical groups had endorsed their use for gender dysphoria. Among them were the American Academy of Pediatrics and the International Endocrine Society, which in 2017 had described the limited research on the effects of the drugs on trans youth as low quality. Still, the organizations were encouraged by what they saw as promising treatment. We've had a lot more research come out since 2017 that has improved the quality of research on trans youth significantly. I think that's specifically referring to where the research was 5 years ago. To make a claim about kind of how the research is now is pretty sketchy. Some leading American practitioners asked AbbVie and Endo Pharmaceuticals, maker of another blocker, to seek FDA approval for the use of the drug among trans adolescents. The drug makers would have to fund research for a patient population that made up just a small part of the market. But the physicians argued that regulatory approval could help establish the safety of the treatment and broaden insurance coverage of the drugs, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars in a year. In the end, AbbVie and Endo said no. This is a bit of an interesting case. Essentially, what they're saying is, oh, you should go ahead and do FDA approval for this other use of puberty blockers, an already FDA-approved drug. Because it's already an FDA-approved drug, it's actually not really going to help with like insurance claims and stuff. The other problem with this is that there's a bit of an ethical concern, which this article is not even touching on. In order to get FDA approval, you have to do randomized controlled trials. So essentially, you would have a group of transgender kids, and you would have an experimental group that does get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and a control group that gets sugar pills. It's rather unethical to give trans kids sugar pills when you are going to be permanently altering their body by making them go through a puberty that our current longitudinal research shows is wrong for them. This article is completely eschewing the ethical considerations of conducting this trial, which I think is very shady and deceptive. The 11-year-old in New York who had begun puberty and started at a new school was increasingly distressed, refusing to bathe or go to class for the first time, expressing a desire to no longer have a girl's body. When the parents consented to blockers in 2018, they hoped the drug would bring emotional stability and time to consider next steps. If everyone thinks this will help and it's reversible, then we need to give this a chance, said the mother. The first 2 years were promising, with the patient, by then a teen, taking Prozac in addition to the blockers. But at the start of the 3rd year, a bone scan was alarming. During treatment, the teen's bone density plummeted from average levels to the range of osteoporosis, a condition of weakened bones more common in older adults. The doctor recommended starting testosterone, explaining that it would help the teen regain bone strength, but the parents had lost faith in the medical counsel. No! This is literally the parents are ruining this. Oh my gosh. So literally, after 2 years is when it's time to go on cross-sex hormones, if that's right for the teen. And that's what fixes the bone density. Yes, we know that teens on puberty blockers have lower bone density than teens that are going through a puberty at that age. That's why you give them cross-sex hormones after 2 years to fix those issues. These parents are going against medical practice, and they're actually harming the bone density of their kid by doing so. It's the parents' fault that this kid's bone density is going to be messed up if it is, because the parents are going against the medical guidance, which would improve the bone density, prescribing testosterone. I was furious, the mother recalled. I'm thinking, I worry we've done permanent damage. No, you haven't. It's reversible. That's why they want to prescribe testosterone, because testosterone will reverse the changes in bone density. Oh my gosh, these parents are frustrating. I don't think we have the science behind them to be prescribing drugs, the mother said. No! The mother just doesn't know anything. The mother's just wrong. She just doesn't know that testosterone will fix the bone density issues, just like the doctor said. Also, I think it's awful that this article has 3 anecdotes, which essentially kind of weights them all equally, where it's like, here's one case where puberty blockers helped someone. Here's one case where puberty blockers were dangerous. And here's one case where puberty blockers were wrong. If you just go away from this article, you'll kind of come up with the assumption that, oh, it looks like it's wrong or dangerous in 2/3 of cases, when the real number is that it seems to be right 98% of the time. And that's just disingenuous to kind of frame it that way. Some doctors and researchers are concerned that puberty blockers may somehow disrupt a formative period of mental growth. With adolescence comes critical thinking, more sophisticated self-reflection, and other significant leaps in brain development. Sex hormones have been shown to affect social and problem-solving skills. We actually have some studies on this. It is true that some mental development is delayed by taking puberty blockers, but what the studies show is that after they stop taking the puberty blockers, the mental development resumes as normal, and the kids do catch up to their peers. So these kind of concerns are completely debunked in the research. J.C. Shavira, looking back at her own experience, thinks the drugs were prescribed too quickly. At 18, she halted her medical treatment and resumed her female identity. Now she is left with a voice that sounds like a man's and other enduring physical changes. If only people saw like a trans person that goes through the wrong puberty in the same way as they're seeing this detrans person. I wish that both trans people and detrans people were afforded the exact same level of social acceptance, support, and access to resources, because they both have some medical needs and resources that are unique. I wish there had been more questions asked by the doctors. I wish I hadn't been steered into transitioning the way I was. I've been told there were other ways to cope with the discomfort of puberty. I mean, this had to have been a person who's been going to gender therapy for years. I mean, like, obviously, if you're going to regret some kind of medical treatment like that, you're going to have some bad feelings about it. But, I mean, there is a lot of screening that goes on for a gender dysphoria diagnosis and for a prescription of puberty blockers, let alone cross-sex hormones. I think this might be kind of like a post-hoc cope, but I don't know. I don't think we can really say for certain. More than a dozen doctors declined to be interviewed for this article, and several who spoke to the Times, some who support treatment, others who question it, asked not to be named. The climate could have a chilling effect on research, says Dr. Natalie Knopkoff, assistant professor of pediatric endocrinology at the University of Colorado, who recently conducted a soon-to-be-published study showing that a longer treatment period on puberty blockers was associated with a lower bone density. Yes, that is true. The longer you're on puberty blockers, the longer you will be delaying the pubertal increases in bone density. It's leading to a concern that people's well-intentioned scientific research could be misconstrued and exploited for political gain. The prospect of such an outcome is disheartening for the families of Emma Basques, Shavira, and the teen in New York. Despite their differing experiences, they share the same hopes for transgender medicine. Less vitriol, more science. I think that this article doesn't contribute to the idea of less vitriol, more science. I think that this article can simply be used for political gain by the anti-trans side. All the fear-mongering tactics they use, all the deception they use. That's the problem. See, what the left wants is, the left wants more research into trans people. The left wants doctors to be able to do research, establish medical guidelines, and follow those medical guidelines. Meanwhile, the right is trying to restrict access to healthcare, restrict research, restrict and ban all these types of established research guidelines, That's the problem. If your conclusion is less vitriol, more science, you are taking the position of the left. So why are they doing this from a reactionary framework? It's because the person who wrote this article is a bit of a reactionary, and there is some really bad journalistic integrity here. Going on the both sides bad train and then being like, let's do less vitriol and more science, which that's not the both sides bad claim. That's the left's claim. We want people to stop trying to ban healthcare and rather to let doctors and scientists do more research and for people to be more informed about these topics. We're trying to inform people, we're trying to advocate for research, and we're trying to advocate for, the established medical guidelines that are backed by research. So yeah, that's that article.